I think it's Tante Vera. Tante is auntie, right? So, yeah, I'm your host, and also there is Tante Fifi, and also Tante Indri and Tante Dewi, inshallah. So, Alhamdulillah, inshallah, everyone is in good health, right? And enjoy the Muktamar, inshallah, right? And thank you for coming for Sister Susie Ismail. Inshallah, Sister Susie is our speaker tonight. Then our theme is everlasting love. Inshallah. Amin. Yeah, may Allah, give His blessing and barakah to our gathering tonight. So inshallah, I'd like to Tante Fifi to be our moderator tonight. Silakan Tante Fifi, tafadholi.
Thank you, Tante Vera. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Alhamdulillahi nahmaduhu wa nasta'inu wa nastaghfiruh wa na'udzubillahi min syururi anfusina wa min sayyiati a'malina may yahdihillahu fala mudhillalah wa may yudhlil fala hadiyalah. Asyhadu an la ilaha illallah wa asyhadu anna Muhammadar abduhu wa rasuluh. Thank you all for coming. Mashallah, we have a lot of brothers and sisters and also moms in the back who's maybe their son or daughter is not interested yet to come, but inshallah it's good. So inshallah, let's start this session by Al-Fatiha. Inshallah, let us straighten our niyah. Inshallah. A'udzubillahi minasyaitonirrajim. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Ar-Rahmanirrahim. Maliki yaumiddin. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. Ihdinas siratal ladzina an'amta 'alaihim ghairil maghdubi 'alaihim waladdallin. Amin. And we are so blessed tonight. We have Dr. Susie Ismail with us. Alhamdulillah, thank you so much for coming. Inshallah, we will all benefit from you, especially the single and us too, the married. Inshallah. Let me read Dr. Susie's bio. Dr. Susie Ismail is the founder and head communication counselor at Cornerstone, a faith-based communication counseling center that focuses on youth identity and relationship rebuilding. She previously taught for 15 years in the communication department at Rutgers University and specialized in presenting a range of communication lectures and diversity workshops at major corporation programs and events, mashallah. And she just come back from Houston, so mashallah, very busy and schedule for her, but alhamdulillah, she can join us in this Muktamar, mashallah. Without further ado, I think I'll let Sister Susie to begin her lecture, inshallah.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله نحمده ونشكره ونستعينه ونستغفره ونتوب إليه ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد محمدا عبده ورسوله رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. السلام عليكم everyone. So I think this is a really interesting gathering. A lot of times at these types of events and programs, it's hit or miss with the singles program. Sometimes you'll see the room overflowing and there's not enough room to house everyone, and sometimes there'll be like one or two people, or there'll be a large number of women and a small number of men, or vice versa. And the reason why I think it's interesting tonight is that I see a relatively equal number, alhamdulillah. I see people who are here interested in the topic, interested in the subject of what is love and what does it mean to have everlasting love, and how do you get there? And I think that's a prerequisite for any type of process, before engaging in the matrimonial process, before thinking about marriage facilitation, this idea of truly learning what it means. We spend a lot of time studying physics and mathematics and, English and writing and all sorts of things that we think this is going to help me in life. Yet one of the most important relationships that we have in life after the relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the relationship with our spouse. And then as time moves on, the relationship with our spouse and how we balance that with our parents, and the relationship with our spouse and with our in-laws, and the relationship we look at the study of marriage, particularly from an Islamic standpoint, I'm still, shocked that we don't have a PhD program in how to be married, because I think that's something that we need. And if we organized it as such, we may seek it out a little bit more. But one thing that often comes to mind when we have these singles programs, and I believe even in this program on the flyer and how it was advertised, we incorporate a certain verse from the Quran. And it's the verse from Surah Al-Rum, which is known as the marriage verse, verse 21 from chapter 30 in the Quran. And in that verse, it's a verse that's often quoted in weddings and at the top of wedding invitations and things of that sort. In that verse, we focus very much on the concept of mawadda wa rahmah, care and mercy. And we speak about marriage as this place of sakina, this place of tranquility that exists within that sphere of care and mercy. But when we read the Quran and when we understand the verses in the Quran, it is incredibly important for us to understand them in context. And so when we look at Surah Al-Rum, rather than kind of zoning in on verse 21 and saying, this is all I need to know about marriage, it's important that we look to the verse before it and the verse that follows it. And the verse that precedes what is known as the marriage verse, verse 21 in Surah Al-Rum, verse 20 speaks to us of how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created us as basharun tantasharun, as human beings who have been dispersed throughout the land. And then there comes this verse of marriage where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds us that in this marriage, in creating this space between man and woman to live in that care and mercy, to live in that tranquility, there is an ayah, there is a miracle. If only we know, if only we think. And then the verse that follows that, verse 22 in Surah Al-Rum, is a verse that speaks to us about the differences in our colors, alwanakum, and the differences in our tongues, alsinatakum. And so when we see the verses of Surah Al-Rum, these particular marriage verses, together in context, we begin to understand, describing for us the process of marriage, one, as a way to know one another. And there is a reminder in that knowing of one another that we are different, and that we are different in our colors, we are different in our tongues, and that we are dispersed around the world. And so this is the first very critical point that we need to understand when it comes to finding a mate or searching for a spouse. That in our Quran, in our deen, we are not limited and told to only seek out those who are of the same ethnic background, those who speak the same language, those who think like us and walk like us and talk like us. No, we are reminded that the core of knowing what it means to have a successful marriage is knowing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and seeking that spouse for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so when we're able to move past the limitations that we sometimes create, we enter into a sphere of something known as kafa'a. Kafa'a is essentially translated in English often as compatibility. But it's not the type of compatibility that you can learn from like taking a Myers-Briggs personality test, or you guys know what I'm talking about, one of those BuzzFeeds, like if you were a food, what food you would be, and and then you see if your mate is the same food. That's not the kafa'a that we're talking about. From an Islamic perspective, kafa'a can be viewed in several different areas. There is a kafa'a that is a kafa'a of, or a compatibility of deen. Where are you spiritually? What are you seeking? Do you know yourself well enough? And this is something that, a lot of times we concentrate so much on knowing the other person. So many times I'll have young couples who will say, oh, we're going to like halal date for a while. I don't know what that means exactly, but some of you may know. Or, we're going to get to know each other on Instagram or Facebook or through email and when the question is like, okay, why are you doing this process preceding the actual marriage process? The response is often, well, I need to know him. I need to know her. But the reality is, and this is a really interesting secular study that was done, studies show that individuals who have dated one another or who have lived with one another for more than a year prior to marriage have a higher divorce rate than couples who did not date or who never lived with each other prior to marriage. So the idea that you have to know someone before deciding to get married is actually a very false notion that has become rooted in our society today to try to propagate the concept of relationships prior to marriage. The key element in successful marriages, and this is something that we see quite frequently at Cornerstone through our marriage counseling and our marriage facilitation programs, the key element is one, knowing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, knowing your deen, knowing what our deen tells us about marriage and the righteous marriage, and following the seerah of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his sunnah in his relationships. And number two, knowing yourself. Who are you? What can you compromise on and what will you never compromise on? What do you seek out that brings you that sakina to your heart? What makes you happy? Because one of the falsest notions in marriage is that when I get married, I will be happy. When I get married, I will be more religious. When I get married, I will, and fill in the blank. Many times we view our marriages as that sense of completion. Some of you may be familiar with an old movie. It's an old movie now, but it's called Jerry Maguire. Are you familiar with it? Yes? Okay, good. What's the famous line in Jerry Maguire? What's the most famous line? Okay, that's one of them, definitely. You had me at hello, yeah. So a lot of times I ask the question and the guys will say, show me the money. And that's not the one that I'm thinking of, but that is a famous line in it. So there's another line in it that's very famous, and it's at the moment where he says, you had me at hello, the woman responds and she says, you complete me. And that concept of completion is something that we label because it's this idea that when you find someone, they will be your completion. And many times we interpret the concept in our deen that marriage is half the deen or marriage is a completion of the deen, meaning when I get married, I will be complete. But that's not what it means. The reason why in our deen we are reminded that marriage is a completion or marriage is half the deen is because it is the relationship in which we must exert the most patience. It is the relationship in which we must be the most selfless. It is the relationship in which we must navigate the waters of interacting with another for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala during the. And this is why it is a completion of our deen, because within the marriage dynamic itself, we find pathways to grow closer and closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through pleasing Allah by pleasing our spouse, through seeking the pleasure of Allah by seeking the pleasure of our spouse. And so this is what completion of the deen really looks like within the marital relationship. But what it means to find a spouse, or what we should seek in a spouse, is again not that completion in that idea of I will be happy when I get married, but instead a complementary relationship. Meaning that when you are with your spouse, you are the best version of yourself. They are the best version of themselves. And that you bring that out in one another through mawadda wa rahmah. Through what we began the conversation with, care and mercy. So what does care and mercy look like in a relationship? You know, when we look at the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and we look at the relationship between the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam and Khadija radiallahu anha, we see a love story like no other. Forget Romeo and Juliet, forget Bella and Edward, or I don't know who's popular now, but whoever, I don't know, Jay-Z and Beyonce, whoever happens to be, you know, the topic of the hour. But really we look at the relationship between the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam and Khadija, and we see something very beautiful. First, we see that Khadija radiallahu anha was a woman who knew herself. She knew what she was seeking in a spouse. She was a woman that was twice widowed. She was a woman of stature in the community. She was a woman who did not think to herself, I need a man to feel complete. She was a woman who felt comfortable enough to seek out characteristics and to say, when someone with these characteristics arrives, this is the person that will make for a good partner. And so when she would hear about the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who was essentially working in the business that she had inherited, the trading of items that she had inherited from her father, she would hear about Al-Amin. And Al-Amin meant, of course, the trustworthy one. And her servant would come back to her when he would travel with the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and he would say, I have never met a man who was more charitable. I have never met a man who was kinder. I have never met a man who was more ethical in his dealings. And Khadija radiallahu anha, who knew who she was, who knew what she was seeking in a spouse, said trustworthy, check. You know, charitable, check. Ethical, check. Kind to people, check. And so she knew what she was seeking. And this was the female at that time. So today when we often tell our girls, you have to sit back and wait for Prince Charming to come along on his white horse or white Porsche, I don't know, whichever one he's going to come along in, right? You know, this is not of our deen. Because our deen reminds us that whether we are men or women, in Surah Al-Ahzab, we see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds us by telling us the believing men and the believing women, the men who guard their privates and the women who guard their privates. And the verse continues to talk about both men and women as being equal in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and being judged on the merit of their deeds. And so we look at the example of Khadija radiallahu anha, who knew herself and knew what she was seeking in a spouse. And so she sent her relative to speak to the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And so her relative went to the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and she didn't say to him, "Ooh, I know someone who likes you." You know, she didn't post on, Snapchat about it. She didn't tweet about it, right? She went to the beloved Messenger of Allah and she said, "What do you think of me? If the opportunity presented itself, if it was the right time, I would marry." And so the relative, again subtly, with haya, with modesty, responded and said, "What do you think of Khadija?" And the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam, in his humble character and demeanor, said, "She is far above me in status." And the relative, the cousin, responded and said, "You should consider Khadija." And in that way, the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam, who was many years younger than Khadija, who was less in terms of inheritance or financial prowess than Khadija radiallahu anha, understood from the relative that if he were to propose, she would accept. And so we know the beloved Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam and Khadija radiallahu anha started their marriage in that way. Now we see the examples of mawadda wa rahma enacted within this relationship. We see the point when the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam first received the revelation, and he shook and he shivered and he wasn't sure how to react. He came from Ghar Hira and he didn't think, let me go tell, my boys what I saw. He didn't say, let me go tell my cousins, my male relatives. He went directly to Khadija radiallahu anha. And it was in her lap that he shook and he shivered and he said, "Cover me, cover me." And as Khadija radiallahu anha covered him physically, emotionally, financially, she stood by his side. This is what mawadda wa rahma looks like. This is what care and mercy is. It is a support of one another. It's a love of one another for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is the selflessness that we speak of. This is the patience that we speak of. And a lot of times we can lose sight of what the marital relationship should really look like because we're blinded by some of the things that we're told through society. Every February 14th, we're bombarded by many Hallmark messages. What is the color that is often most evident in these messages? I heard pink, I heard what else? Red, yes, okay. So it's usually red, pink, shades of red. Now psychology shows us that, red has been equated in society that with red equals love. But the emotion of red, or what red elicits in the emotional sphere, is very different than what we understand love to be. So have you ever seen in Spain, when they have the bullfights and the matador shakes something in front of what does he shake? He shakes a cloth that's usually the color red. Now interestingly enough, bulls are colorblind. So they're not shaking the red cloth in order to anger the bull. What are they shaking the red cloth for? And it's not that they want the crowd to fall in love with the bull, right? That's not what they're seeking, right? What they're seeking is to elicit an intense passion, a passion that is equated with anger, with rage, a passion that is so intense that it can lead into the negatives. And yet we've been deluded to believe that red is equated with love, that if you don't feel fireworks, if you are not feeling this intense, crazy passion, then this person is not for you. Then something's wrong. And this lie that we've been fed is in direct contradiction to what Rome reminds us love and marriage looks like. Because there is nothing in the Quran that describes marriage as a passionate affair that is, colored red. Instead, it is described as a place of tranquility. لِتَسْكَنُوا إِلَيْهَا. The purpose of our marriage, when we look at that term لِتَسْكَنُوا in the Quran, we see that it comes from the root word of sakan or sukoon. When we are reading the Quran and we come to a sukoon, what do we do in our tajweed? We stop and we take a breath. Okay? So we stop and we take a breath, and this is what our marriages should look like. They should be a place of tranquility where we can stop and take a breath. Where when the world is crazy around us, when we're shivering in fear and we're not sure what to make of the world around us, our marriages should be that place where we can catch our breath. And yes, there will be moments of passion. And yes, there will be moments where we do see red. It might be red where we're really angry at our spouse and we're like, remind me again why I married you. And they're madly in love with our spouse, and we can't thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala enough for His mercy and His rahmah in granting us this person in our lives. But that's not the meaning of marriage. Those are moments in our marriage. And many times today, when we go online, we look at, again, Instagram or Snapchat or Facebook, we look at our feeds and we see pictures of couples holding hands on the beach in Fiji. We see a happy family in front of the castle in Disney World. And we think this is what marriage looks like. This is what I need. But really, marriage is all of the moments that don't make it to our Facebook feed. Marriage is all of the moments that don't make it into the photo album. Marriage is all of the conversations that we have over breakfast that we forget about a few minutes later. Marriage is who wakes up earlier to make the other person a cup of coffee. Marriage is about the moments of mawadda wa rahmah, of care and mercy, that envelope our spouse in that sense of security, and that envelope us in that sense of safety, and that sense of togetherness for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, I don't know how we're doing on time, so I just want to, because I could go all night about this, so we have about 15 minutes, alhamdulillah. Okay, so we're just scratching the surface right now, right? We're just starting with understanding what is marriage, right? So are we going to have time for questions, or we will? Alhamdulillah, good. So we're just trying to understand what marriage is as a whole. But now let's dive. What happens throughout the process? How do we get married, first of all? And when we asked the question of who here was single, there was lots of hands raised. So I think, today, again, we've got these, all these social, lowered our guard a little bit. And one of the most beautiful characteristics of our deen is the characteristic of haya, or modesty. And that modesty encompasses more than just how we dress, even though we often equate haya with hijab. But it really encompasses how we carry ourselves, how we talk, how we interact, what we think, what we see, what we allow our ears to hear, what we allow our fingers. And so maintaining that sense of haya is critical, and particularly as we begin to enter into that marriage process. So we'll take a scenario, for example. You're sitting in calculus class, you're in college, maybe you're at work, and you're sitting there, and Amina walks in, and you're like, ooh, Amina, mashallah, yes, mashallah, tabarakallah, Allahu Akbar, yes. So you're thinking, okay, this is someone I may be interested in. What's the next step? What normally happens? What is it? You go back to work? All right, well, that's one way of doing it, but no. Lots of times you'll talk to the person. You'll say, hey, what is it called? Snapchat handle? What is it? Snapchat? I don't even know what it's called. Whatever it is. Whatever it is. What's your... Okay. MySpace? Does that even exist anymore? Yeah? Okay. So you try to connect with the person, right? And you try to find a way to connect with them. A lot of times the way to connect these days is directly through social media. Now, the difficulty in connecting through social media is it takes us back to what we first started talking about, the idea that you have to know the person or you have to get to know the person. And in that process of getting to know the person, many times we lose sense of that hayat. Many times it can be very easy to slip into a place where it's like, oh, they call it courage juice, where you're behind a screen and things that you would type or things that you would post are very different than what you would say in person. So let's go back to our examples of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam and Khadija. Knowing yourself and also knowing who in the community can be a connector. So I think you have some sisters in the community here, mashallah, who I believe run the marriage facilitation program here in the Muqtamar. There are people in your community. A lot of times we say, well, there's no one around anymore, like at the time of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But those people exist. In your college, you may have a chaplain. You may have the imam who normally leads in the masjid. You may have, an uncle who happens to know everyone. You have an auntie who happens to know everyone. Reach out, because we cannot have successful marriages if we do not have the support of the ummah. And this is why so many of our marriages are falling apart. Recent statistics from a study that was done by ISPU, the Islamic Social Policy Unit or something, I don't remember what it stands for exactly, but ISPU. They recently released a study on the percentage of divorces among the American Muslims. And we used to say, at large, this was about 10, 15 years ago, at large, the American community is almost at 50% divorce rate. The Muslim community is only about 30% divorce rate. But right now, the Muslim community is at a 48% divorce rate. That means if we look around this room, 50% of the people in this room, according to statistics, will end up with a divorce. Unless we seek to realign the direction that we're moving in terms of our marriages. We seek to realign what it is that we're even seeking in our marriages and what it is that we expect to get out of our marriages. We're heading right now in terms of expectations that may be built on false notions, in terms of the getting to know someone in a way that may compromise our hayat, in terms of getting to know each other and focusing on the dunya more than on the akhirah. We are seeing so many difficulties happening in relationships. So what are the difficulties that we're seeing and how can we counter them? There are 5 areas of concern that we break what was termed or here in this session was called everlasting love. That seeking of a spouse that you will love in dunya and you will be with in akhirah. So those areas consist of domestic violence, and the domestic violence is not only in the form of physical abuse, but we are seeing a great deal of emotional abuse, of verbal abuse, of financial abuse, and abuses that go far beyond what describes mawadda wa rahmah, that don't exist within that realm of mawadda wa rahmah. We are also seeing a great deal of difficulty with infidelity. And this goes back to the topic of hayat. And yes, infidelity is an issue in our Muslim community. And it's not just physical infidelity. In the past, we may have described infidelity as, physically meeting with someone behind the shed after work. That's not what's happening. We're seeing a lot of emotional infidelity. Emotionally giving that part of yourself that is reserved for your spouse or that should be shared only with your spouse to someone else. And it happens through emails, it happens through texts, it happens through Facebook, it happens through Snapchat, it happens through Twitter. And again, if we begin our path in a relationship or in starting a relationship by letting our guard down in terms of hayat, it doesn't end with marriage. And this is what we consistently see over and over again. That if you're finding your spouse in a way that is not pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then it is very difficult to build a relationship on a foundation that's pleasing to Allah throughout the relationship. So we said domestic violence, infidelity. The third issue that we're seeing a great deal of difficulty with is parents and in-laws. And we could probably do a whole other session just on that. But since we don't have a lot of time, maybe at some point in the Muqtamar we'll be able to cover that. But I think, when we look at our parents, many times we do struggle as parents and as a parent with attachment issues. And we look at the examples in our Islamic history. We look at Salam, for example, where he made that sincere dua for a child. And when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed him with Ismail alayhi salam, the first commandment that he received, or the first thing that he had to do, was to separate himself from his infant son and to leave Ismail alayhi salam and Hajar in the desert. And then years later, again, Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam, who is known as Al-Hanif, the friend of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, was again tested in his attachment to his child by being commanded to sacrifice his child when he was in his teens. And yet today, as parents, many times, we feel very possessive about our children. Sessions throughout the Muqtamar, so make sure your parents come, okay? We're going to talk about the importance of detaching and being able to, children do have their own lives. But that is a difficulty that we do see definitely with parents and in-laws. The third area that we see a lot of difficulties. So we live in an era where, again, we have both men and women primarily working outside of the home. And there's a lot of times we like to cherry pick in our deen. So we have a lot of couples who will come to our office and the woman may say, well, it's my right as a Muslim woman to have my own wealth. It's my right to have my own bank account. It's my right, if I want to buy $1,000 bag, I'm going to buy $1,000 bag. In the meantime, the husband is like, I can't pay the rent. We're behind on our mortgage. We can't afford this $1,000 bag. Is this a case of mawadda wa rahma? Is this a case where the couple together is working hand in hand? Is this a case where, when we look at, again, the example of Khadija radiallahu anha, who was one of the wealthiest women in town at the time, at her death, they barely had anything to eat. They were eating leaves, her and the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So when we talk about mawadda wa rahma, it is something that has to come through the marriage in all its aspect. And the final element that we see as one of the largest reasons for divorces among couples is stress. And that stress, it encompasses many things, of course, but stress in terms of raising the children, stress in terms of not seeing eye to eye on, directionally where the couple is going, stress in many factors. And again, throughout these elements, one of the things that is most missing in the relationship in trying to seek out that everlasting love is the emotional element, the empathy that the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam showed us in terms of how he related to his wives. One of my favorite narrations of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam is a hadith that's narrated by Aisha radiallahu anha, where she said there was a period of time where she was on her menses and she was sitting with the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and she took a cup of water and she drank from it. And she said the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam took that same cup, turned it to the part where her lips had touched, and he drank from that same spot. Why? Because he knew that his wife was in a period of time where she felt vulnerable, she felt unclean maybe. He could anticipate her emotional needs without her having to say a word. And so by that small gesture of taking the cup and drinking from the spot that her lips had touched, Ya Allah, this is mawadda wa rahma. Subhanallah. There's another beautiful narration from Aisha radiallahu anha. Oh, they're all going to be drinking from the same cup now? How are we on time? 4 minutes, okay. 5 minutes. Subhanallah. And we see though this relationship was reciprocal. Again, the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, from his emotional intelligence, from his empathy and his reaching out to his beloved wives, to the mothers of the believers, we see that they reciprocated that. And another beautiful narration from Aisha radiallahu anha, she spoke of a time where there was a weapons demonstration that was occurring in the masjid. And so the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam asked her, do you want to watch it? And she said yes. And so she stood behind the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and she said she anchored her arms around his waist. And because she was shorter than him, she rested her chin upon his shoulder, and she rested her cheek upon the cheek of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And she said we stood there for some time, and the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam said to her, have you seen enough? And she responded and said no. So she said we stood for some time longer, and again the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, have you seen enough? And again she said no. And she said a third time he asked, have you seen enough after some time? And then I said yes. And in giving this narration, Aisha radiallahu anha said, Wallahi, I had no interest in the weapons demonstration, but I so loved standing so close to the beloved Messenger of Allah, with my arms encircling his waist, with my chin resting upon his shoulder cheek, knowing that if I had wanted to stand there longer and longer, he would patiently wait. Again, this is mawadda wa rahmah. This is everlasting love. This is a love that's rooted in a love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. A love that's rooted in knowing that you will seek the pleasure of Allah when you seek the pleasure of your spouse for His sake and His sake alone. I think we're coming to the end of our time here, but there's a great deal more that we can talk about in terms of love. Just a few thoughts to leave you with. Before you get married, there are some secular books that I want you to read and some religious books as well. So there's a cute little book by Gary Chapman named The 5 Languages of Love. Read it. Read it, because when we look at the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we see that he encompassed all 5 languages and he spoke them beautifully with each of his wives. And he would adjust based on, there's beautiful ahadith that remind us and that exhibit that. So read the 5 languages of love, but read it along with the seerah of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Read it in conjunction with understanding how the beloved Messenger of Allah lived his life in his marriage. And there's a whole other list of books that I can share with you and speak to me. We also have a marriage facilitation program through Cornerstone. It is completely free as well, so don't leave any stone unturned. Work with the Muqtamar marriage facilitation. Fill out our forms as well. You never know where your nasib is, and if you're at that point where you feel like you're ready, really seek out that knowledge, because that's one of the most critical steps of having a successful marriage, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair. May Allah bless you all with righteous spouses, inshallah.
MashaAllah, takbir. Jazakallah khair, Dr. Susie, for that beautiful, beautiful lectures. MashaAllah, it reminds all of us how beautiful is the story of our Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam and Khadijah radiallahu anhu. May us all, reach the mawadah and sakinah like them too, inshallah. And for our singles, brothers and sisters, inshallah, they can reach the same thing, inshallah. We have 15 minutes of question and answer. If you like to. Kenapa? Okay. Anybody want to have question? $15 minutes only. Let me maybe summarize a little bit. So mawadah and rahmah is a love for one another for the sake of Allah, from husband and wife. So we try to please our spouse, to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then marriage should be tranquil, to be, what you call it? To be happy with one another. And then we should have haya, and it's very important, how we carry ourselves, how we post on Facebook, on Twitter, or in Instagram. And then the key of the successful marriage is to know yourself. And it's very important too, Dr. Susie mentioned that we have to reach out to our community, to your mom and dad, or any, uncle or imam that know a lot of people in your community, so they can help you, inshallah. And then Dr. Susie also touched about the problem in marriage, like domestic violence, infidelity, parents' involvement, finance, and stress. And then Dr. Susie also mentioned to read some books. One of them is 5 Languages of Love. All right. Any question? Okay. You don't need a mic? Okay.
So that's a really good question. The question was, when do you start praying istikhara in terms of marriage? Right? So I'm going to precede that a little bit with another question that's usually asked about this topic, which is, how do I know? How do I know? My parents come to me and they say, oh, there's this, beautiful girl, or there's this great guy, and, how do I know if I should move further, if I should even engage in this process or not? So I think the how do you know it's difficult because we seek certainty. And we tend to be here in the US, we tend to be a very high uncertainty avoidance culture. And so if you're going to look up other things, please also look up Hofstede's 5 value dimensions. This is a critical component of marriage that's often ignored, but it's Hofstede's 5 value dimensions, and you'll see how they play out in terms of your personality. So we're high uncertainty, which means we don't like uncertainty. So we say inshallah all of the time, but do we actually believe inshallah, or do we want to know? We want to know who we're going to marry, when we're going to get married, how many kids we're going to have, the color of our house, we want to know, right? So this is where tawakkul comes into play. And tawakkul is an incredibly important component of our deen. So we often think of tawakkul as saying, okay, well, I trust that Allah is the best of all planners. But there are 2 elements, and we know in Arabic language, a difference in terms of a hamza or a shadda can change the meaning of the word. So there is a word that is tawakkul. Tawakkul is when we say, Allah is the best of all planners, and we sit at home eating a bag of Doritos and say, He's going to send me my spouse when the time is right. Okay? That's not what we want to do. Okay? Tawakkul is an active perseverance with that understanding and that recognition that Allah is the best of all planners. So we see tawakkul, for example, in the example of Maryam radiallahu anha. We see that when Maryam was told by Jibreel that she would bear a child, she had that sense of tawakkul, that faith, that reliance upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But at that same time when she was commanded and told she would bear a child, she also received a commandment, and we see the verse in the Quran, to shake the trunk of the palm tree, to do something, to take an action. The concept of tawakkul in every example in the Quran and in our Islamic history is wrapped with an action. So again, we go to the example of Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam. And when Hajar and Ismail were in the desert, radiallahu anhum, we see that when the baby, Hajar was fully confident that Allah was the best of all planners and He would provide for them, but she didn't sit still. She committed to sa'i, and sa'i in Arabic, that term means to strive. And the sa'i was 7 times back and forth from Safa and Marwa looking for water. She never doubted that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would provide, but that is tawakkul. She did her part. So I know I'm taking a circuitous route to answer the question, but we're going to get there. So step 1, and how do you know? Do your part. Meaning don't close doors. Meaning if your family comes to you and says, I have the perfect person for you, don't just shut the door and say, nope, not interested. I'm definitely not going to get married now. Engage with your family. Ask why. Why do you think this person is perfect? Again, remember the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, when Ali radiallahu anhu came to him and he was embarrassed, he had that haya. He wanted to speak to the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam about asking for his daughter Fatima radiallahu anha's hand in marriage. But he kind of, stumbled over his words a little bit. And the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said to him, you are here to ask for Fatima's hand. And then Ali radiallahu anhu kind of nodded, And the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said he had already decided that they would be a good match for each other. So the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam knew his daughter so well, knew Ali radiallahu anhu so well, that he knew they would be a good match for one another. Sometimes as parents, we think we know our children, and so we think we know the person that's best for them, but we also have to realize that as parents, and again, this is why the parenting sessions are going to be important, inshallah, over the next few days, make sure your parents come, okay? It's also important that as parents that we know that we have our own, fallibilities sometimes in trying to evaluate. So number 1, don't close the door. Engage, find out more, learn about who this person is. Number 2, pray istikhara. So when should you pray istikhara? There is a narration from the Sahaba of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam that before they would enter the marketplace in order to purchase shoes, they would pray istikhara. And when they were asked, why are you praying istikhara? You're only purchasing shoes. It's, it's something that's common. They said, if we choose the wrong pair of shoes, they may be the shoes that lead us into Jahannam. And we want to ensure that we select the shoes that enter us into Jannah. So imagine if the Sahaba were making istikhara over shoes. Should we not be making istikhara over who we're going to spend our lives with? So start making istikhara when your parents come and say, hey, I think I have someone for you. When someone in the community approaches you, when a brother or a sister indicates that they may be interested and they feel that you have the characteristics they're looking for, pray istikhara, pray istikhara, pray istikhara at least 7 times. And many times we pray istikhara and we think, I'm going to get a sign. I'm going to wake up in the middle of the night, I'm going to have a dream, and I'm going to know whether or not this should be yes or no. Istikhara is a wing of tawakkul, meaning that you have in your heart that contentment that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the best of all planners. You are seeking guidance from Allah in that istikhara prayer, but you're also doing your part. So you don't just pray istikhara and you say, I didn't feel anything, so I don't think he's the one. No, you pray istikhara and then you seek out, learn about this person, ask about this person in the sense of courtship. We often equate courtship to, if you ever watched that show Little House on the Prairie. Anyone familiar with it? Yeah, okay. So when Laura Ingalls, the one of the main characters, when there was someone who had seen her in the community and was interested in her, what did he do? He didn't date her. He didn't like Snapchat her or Twitter her or whatever it was. He went to her home. And he would go to her home several times where they would sit around with the family and speak to one another. And this sense of courtship, again, it preceded even, our communities immigrating to this country. Because it's a way of understanding and getting to know someone in a way that does not preclude or put you in a position that makes. So continue to pray that istikhara. And I often, when I have the marriage talks, especially with singles, and this is a small gathering, so I feel like I can share it with you. I often share like my own story of marriage because, like, believe it or not, there was a time, a long time ago, where I was like you guys, And I mean, alhamdulillah, I've been married now for over 21 years, so it's been quite some time now, alhamdulillah. But, my husband, our freshman year in college, we both took Arabic class. So if you're in college, take Arabic class. But we were both in Arabic class. And I remember it was my first semester. And my husband came up to me, my current husband, and he said, I want to marry you. And I'm like, what? I am 18. I have a lot of goals ahead of me. I'm going to get my doctorate. I'm going to work. I'm like, marriage is not in the picture now. And even if it was, it wouldn't be you. So I was very like, and he knows I tell this story, so he's okay with it. So anyway, well, fast forward. Every year of college, he would come and approach me and he would say, I'm going to marry you. And I'd be like, over my dead body and your dead body and half the town's dead bodies, it's not going to happen. So, and for me, honestly, and this is where I say, like, sometimes for us, we lack, we say, but do we really act upon it? So I had closed the door because for me, I thought marriage is not something that I want to do right now. And even if I did, he doesn't have, the looks of Tom Cruise that I'm looking for, or he doesn't have whatever it was. Back in the day, Tom Cruise was a looker, not anymore, but so, but there were things that I felt that this person doesn't have what I'm looking for. So fast forward many approaches, and it was my senior year in college, and I still recall it was actually my birthday, and not that I celebrated birthdays or anything, but I was 21, and I was like, it's it'd be nice if somebody remembered my birthday. Nobody remembered my birthday. And then my now husband had sent me an email. And this was the 90s, mind you. So email was a very new thing. The whole internet was a new thing. And we used to have to go to like this basement place in the university in order to use computers, in order to access email. He sent me an email, and in it he said, happy birthday, and by the way, I'm still going to marry you. So anyway, at that point, I was like, wow, like he's literally the only person that remembered my birthday. And so I told him, you know what, you can come over, come talk to my parents. When he came over, and we still laugh about this, and my kids laugh about it now, I had a packet of questions, 200 questions. And I said, if he sits through all of these questions, then maybe I'll. I asked him, were questions like, if you were a cartoon character, what cartoon character would you be? You know, if there was one food that you would never eat again, what food would it be? If you were to win an award for something, what would the award be for? You know, if someone was going to play you in an autobiography movie that they're making, what actor would it be? You know? And alhamdulillah, you know, I'm happy to say he passed. So I think in that process, though, despite having, you know, seen my husband in college for 4 years, despite knowing that he was super involved in the MSA, despite knowing, you know, I didn't really think that that he had the characteristics I was looking for. And it was because I trusted myself rather than trusting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because I relied too much on what I thought I knew rather than relying on the ultimate plan of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so I share this because I remember those days and I know how hard it can be. But if you find yourself trying to close doors because you think you know best, I'm here to tell you don't. Don't close those doors. But of all planners, and things will happen when the time is right. But do your part. Have that tawakkul. That was a long answer. I apologize.
Thank you, Dr. Susie. Maybe one last question. Anyone from the brothers, maybe? Nothing? Okay. You can.
Okay, so very good question. You know, what happens if you stumble across someone who has really good characteristics? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds us that He knows us better than we know ourselves. That He is closer to us than our jugular vein. And so we do not question the hikmah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has clearly given us His hikmah in knowing that as a female, that as a female, as a Muslim female cannot marry anyone other than a Muslim. Now, a Muslim male, this is a question that we get quite frequently about the people of the book. Can a Muslim male marry someone who is Christian or Jewish? Many scholars have researched this topic and have really tried to apply the fiqh and the usul of it. And many of them have come to the point of realization that many of those who ascribe to Judaism and Christianity today ascribe to shirk. They do not follow the people of the book who truly believed in the book and believed in La ilaha illallah at the time of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So I'm not going to give a fatwa, you know, either way about this topic. There are many scholars who have studied the fiqh of this topic, and I would definitely, encourage you to speak to them, and I can give you their contact information as well. But I also want to talk about this from the marriage counselor perspective. Remember that term we used in the beginning, kafa'a? Kafa'a, compatibility, is incredibly important, okay? And so if you have grown up in a household that truly, allowed you to experience what it means to be Muslim. Even if there are days where you couldn't wake up for Fajr, even if there are days where you struggled with your hijab, where you struggled with your modesty, even if there were days where, you felt like, I could probably be a better Muslim. But still having that root of a return to the fitrah. And the fitrah is that being born with that connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, knowing the truth within ourselves, where all of us are born with that fitrah, and not being corrupted by society to be pulled towards something different. If you have lived that life and tasted the truth, any marriage that is a marriage with someone who has not experienced that truth, who has not come to truly believe in La ilaha illallah, there will be no kafa'a between you. There will not be spiritual compatibility between you. So first we look again at the religious aspect of it, the hikmah of Allah, and then we look at it from the terms of the compatibility even. Who has good characteristics. If there is someone that you feel like, okay, this is a person who I really think I could marry, if only they were Muslim. seek out ways to teach this person about Islam. Or maybe if you have feelings for them, you shouldn't be the one teaching this person about Islam. You should probably put up that hijab, put up that boundaries between you and him, or you and her, because you may fall into the haram in that way. But be the best Muslim that you can be, and know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala yahdi man yasha. And if it's written for this person to come to Islam without you being involved, then this person will be halal for you. But if it is written that this person stays in the dhalam, then you make sincere dua for them. You ask that Allah guide them, and you ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guides your heart to that which is most pleasing to Him. And there's a beautiful dua that I think we could kind of close with, which is one that we should consistently repeat, that the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam would repeat all of the time. And it is, Ya muqallib al-qulub, thabbit qalbi ala dinak. O changer of the hearts, keep my heart steadfast on your faith. Because that is the one thing that must maintain or be retained in our hearts. Because there will be times where even within the best of marriages, we may look at our spouse and be like, I'm really annoyed at you right now. Like, I love you for the sake of Allah, but I'm really annoyed at you right now. You know? And so our hearts will wait to salah, our hearts and our iman goes up. And you want to be in a relationship with someone who will repeat this dua with you, Ya muqallib al-qulub, thabbit qalbi ala dinak, so that together you will maintain that relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and inshallah in doing so, you'll maintain a beautiful relationship with one another.
Thank you so much, Dr. Susie. Because we have time constraint, we have to end the lecture part of this activity right now. I want to hear more from you, mashallah. What a beautiful lecture, and I'm sure everybody wants to hear more from you. But thank you so much. May Allah reward you. I'm sure we all benefit from you, mashallah. Thank you. And for all, let me close by the dua. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika, asadu alla ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. And for all the participants, we have snacks in the back. And then please come back. We have games and activities for you guys. So, all right. Thank you so much. Yes, I will make sure I'm coming.
Jazakillah khair, sisters, inshallah. Yeah, we're going to have a break for 10 minutes, and